March 1944. A Soviet captain commits an act of blatant high treason right on the front lines. His own headquarters has promised him a bullet to the back of the head. The blocking detachments are already in position to mow down his crew with machine guns. For what? To transform the frozen slush of the spring thaw into an intricate physical death trap for 30 German heavy tanks? This isn't some heroic army feat. It's a cold, predatory hunger for efficient slaughter, where simple gravity and a slick slope break 45 tons of Krupp steel faster than any howitzer. We will strip the anatomy of this filthy butchery down to the last bolt. Wait for the end. That is where the true, terrifying scale of how a single rogue order collapsed an entire front and forced multi-ton machines to crush their own men alive is hidden. A snapped track link smokes heavily in the icy slush. A charred crater spews the sickening stench of burnt diesel and scorched human flesh. Mangled metal cools rapidly under the piercing March wind. 45 tons of mass, barreling forward at 30 kilometers per hour, isn't stopped by human flesh. It is stopped only by brutal physics. War is not a test of courage. It is a merciless test of the resistance of materials. March 1944, Western Ukraine. The spring thaw, the Rasputitsa, has turned the shattered earth into a viscous, sucking trap. The air temperature hovers constantly around freezing. Thick, nocturnal moisture inevitably becomes morning ice. The ground beneath one's feet trembles continuously. This isn't local seismic activity. It is the methodical, heavy march of an enemy armored spearhead. A crushing blow is looming. New German heavy tanks are slicing through the Soviet defense. They are ruthlessly flattening artillery crews, treading crushed guns and men deep into the cold soil. They are methodically incinerating any surviving equipment. The mathematics of this head-on collision reads like a dry, non-negotiable death sentence. A standard 9.2 kilogram armor-piercing round, spat from an 85mm tank gun, rapidly loses its kinetic energy in the dense, freezing air. At a range of over 1,000 meters, this chunk of steel can do little more than kick up sparks from sloped frontal armor 80 millimeters thick. It is a duel between a surgical scalpel and an armored rhino. Shells ricochet off the frontal plate with a piercing howl, streaking into the low gray sky as useless tracers. Command, exhausted by heavy fighting, sees no way out. A catastrophe in the open field is inevitable. A frontal assault means the guaranteed annihilation of the battalion in a matter of minutes. Burning hulls would be the only result of such an engagement. The statistics of death are measured in millimeters of homogeneous armor and joules of penetrative force. Animalistic, paralyzing fear is suppressed only by iron will and mechanical automation. The enemy's armor is invulnerable. But is the earth itself? This is where the cold calculation begins. The Soviet school of tank design built its machines for rapid, deep, and maneuverable warfare. A tank with an 85mm gun is 32 tons of agile fury. Its diesel engine cranks out 500 horsepower. Steel armor is the crew's second skin, but in the endless, icy mud, any maneuver chokes and dies. Inside the cramped fighting compartment, there is absolutely no room for soul-searching or reflection. The crew's physiology is entirely dictated by the mechanical rhythm of the machine. The driver's palms, worn into raw, bloody meat, grip the stiff steel steering levers of the friction clutches. Black grease and grime are ground deep under his fingernails. Acrid carbon monoxide from burnt propellant settles thick in the lungs, searing the throat with every breath. A constant, crushing ringing fills the ears. The roar of the 12-cylinder diesel merges with the sharp clatter of metal on metal in the biting frost. Fear left a long time ago. All that remains is a ringing void and honed reflexes. A tank is a steel fist in which characters are smelted. The men function strictly as biological appendages to the massive breech, the optical sight, and the stiff fuel pedals. The battalion command post is located in a damp, hastily dug bunker. The air inside is thick with the smell of cheap shag tobacco, unwashed bodies, and raw earth. The battalion commander is hunched heavily over a spread-out topographic map. Captain Sobolev stands opposite the crudely built table. He is a cold-blooded professional, burnt out from the inside. He understands the essence of an asymmetrical response with absolute clarity. Direct kinetic confrontation leads to guaranteed death. 24 heavy machines are pushing straight down the graded road. The commander's voice sounds raspy. His phrases are clipped, barely audible over the rumble of the approaching cannonade. Our defense has been completely steamrolled. We won't stop them head-on, Sobolev says, his eyes never leaving the elevation markings on the paper. At point-blank range, their frontal armor holds our slugs easily. We'll just burn on the first line. Your task is to stop the breakthrough. There are no reserves left. There's no time left either. Understood. Permission to act. The short conversation is over. No parting words or wishes of luck. A grim order is instantly converted into hard, calculated action. A critical situation doesn't require discussion. It dictates the necessity of an immediate solution. Sobolev steps out quickly into the cold, biting wind. He assesses the surrounding topography with a predatory gaze. Deep ravines and frozen ice serve as the cold backdrop for the looming tragedy. A driver's view through a narrow vision slit would show only flying mud and death. But the cold eye of a tactician sees a critical vulnerability in the very mass of the advancing enemy. 45 tons of high-quality steel require the firmest possible footing beneath wide tracks. Without reliable traction, this lethal machine inevitably turns into an uncontrollable, sliding target. The logistics of winter warfare dictate their own relentless conditions. The combat load stowed in the racks is strictly limited. The air temperature is plummeting below zero. The icy mud of the spring thaw is beginning to set into a slick crust. In his head, Sobolev calculates the mass of the armor, its speed, and the coefficient of friction of steel on ice. He makes the only correct decision: to use the difficult terrain itself as his primary, most powerful weapon. The laws of physics must break the advancing wedge before the enemy guns reach a comfortable engagement range. The crew silently takes their usual places in the chilled combat vehicle. The powerful starter grinds to life. The tank's diesel bellows under the strain, spitting out a thick cloud of bluish, acrid smoke. With maximum physical effort, the driver pulls the left lever. The multi-ton armored machine goes into a sharp pivot. The tank's wide tracks crunch through the thin evening ice as it heads purposefully toward a deep, brush-choked ravine. Far ahead, beyond the line of hills, lies a narrow, steep paved descent leading to a stone crossing. It is there, at the strategic intersection of frozen earth and turbulent water, that a half-ruined old mill stands. The old mill greets the crew with icy silence and the long, drawn-out creak of frozen, rotting timbers. This isn't just a ruined building on the edge of a deep ravine. It is a perfect topographical anomaly, capable of turning the tide of the coming battle. A steep paved descent leads from the hilltop straight to a narrow stone bridge over a stream. The slope is exactly 15 degrees. For advancing infantry, it's a minor obstacle that merely breaks their breathing rhythm. But for 45 tons of German armor, barreling at March speed in a tight column, it is the invisible boundary between total control and irreversible chaos. A tank battle on open, level ground is the mathematics of certain death. The battalion would bleed out completely in the first 20 minutes of visual contact. The frontal Krupp steel of the enemy's heavy machines would easily withstand the impact of Soviet blunt-nosed shells at medium ranges. Captain Sobolev has no intention of submissively burning according to the rules of someone else's tactics. War is the grueling, filthy work of ditch diggers and mechanics, not a place for beautiful, sacrificial heroics. Heroism here is nothing but cold engineering calculation, brutally multiplied by the animal reflex of self-preservation. The crew decides on an act of daring, unheard of insubordination. Physics must break the advancing armada long before the chemistry of gunpowder comes into play. Time compresses rapidly into short, frantic gasps. A sapper squad and 4 exhausted tankers dig savagely into the frozen soil of the old earthen dam. The ground hums and responds with the hardness of concrete under the blows of blunt steel crowbars. Sparks fly from the dull metal into the pitch-black cold of the March night, catching the faces of men contorted by extreme strain for fractions of a second. The frost quickly drops to -12 degrees Celsius. Yet the soldiers' faded, quilted jackets are soaked through with acrid, sticky sweat. The crew's physiology is operating at the very edge of biological limits. Back and shoulder muscles seize in agonizing, tearing cramps with every monotonous swing of a heavy pickaxe. Palms worn to raw meat freeze to the icy wooden handles. Bursting, bloody calluses ooze fluid that instantly mixes with ground-in grease and stinging peat dust. No one pays the slightest attention to the throbbing pain in their joints. Sharp physical pain is a clear signal. The body is still alive. The ringing and shell-shocked ears from the non-stop cannonade on the eastern horizon is replaced by the nearby, rhythmic, dry snap of breaking river ice. "Crowbar, here!" the loader rasps hoarsely. He spits thick, dark saliva onto the trampled, dirty snow. "Hit it at the base," Sobolev snaps. He throws his entire weight against a stubborn sluice timber locked in years of ice. "Cut the main bracing." Dialogue in the darkness is reduced to primitive, clipped vocal commands. The men have absolutely no physical strength left for extra syllables or displays of emotion. Every loudly spoken word robs precious oxygen from burning lungs. The engineering of this improvised ambush requires surgical precision in conditions of absolute nocturnal blindness. This isn't just the mindless destruction of a water barrier under the cover of darkness. It is the deliberate creation of a directed channel for a future catastrophe. The main engineering task is to carefully breach the old dam exactly so that the released, roaring torrent of icy water hits the center of the wide, paved road. The cobblestones, beaten by heavy wheels, are currently covered in a thin, deceptive layer of slick spring mud. The water must wash away this natural abrasive and fill every microscopic gap between the frozen stones to the brim. The gathering morning frost will methodically do the rest of the dirty work for the anti-tank artillery. In a matter of hours, it will turn the steep stone descent into a monolithic, impossibly slick mirror. The mechanics of any heavy-tracked vehicle have one critical, fatal vulnerability. The smooth, wide steel tracks of combat machines have absolutely no traction on frozen ice without special grousers. With immense mass and a high center of gravity due to the heavy turret and long-barreled gun, gravity will relentlessly pull the multi-ton steel hull down the steep slope. The force of useful friction will instantly drop to zero. Inertia will become the sole, merciless master of the situation. The last supporting timber of the dam gives way with a long, agonizing groan under the pressure of the weakened structure. It snaps in half with a dull crack, violently throwing off sharp, frozen splinters. Black, searingly cold water erupts from its years of earthen captivity with a loud, primal roar. It knocks the exhausted, weakened sappers off their feet. It fills high boots with heavy, icy lead. The turbulent, filthy torrent rushes greedily down the slope, predatory and precise as it follows the curves of the paved road. Sobolev breathes heavily and raggedly, leaning hard on a shovel handle. His sharp gaze through the nocturnal, frozen mist catches the dark water spreading evenly over the uneven stones of the descent. The ambient temperature continues to drop relentlessly. Right before his eyes, the wet, oily sheen of the cobblestones begins to dull rapidly, quickly skinning over with a matte, lethal crust of fresh ice. The trap is reliably set. The snare is flooded with the cold fury of nature. The soldier's hands shake violently from the extreme muscle strain and the onset of hypothermia. Damp, sweat-soaked clothes stand stiff as boards in the piercing, icy wind, completely restricting movement. The heavy, thankless, dirty work has been completed on schedule. The enemy's armor is still approaching, forming a strike fist. But the merciless mechanism of war is already demanding blood and submission within their own ranks. Unauthorized alteration of HQ-approved positions, abandoning a designated defensive line, and intentional destruction of road infrastructure. This is a guaranteed firing squad. The ice on the steep descent is hardening rapidly, becoming stronger than any armor. And now, this perfect tactical plan must survive the inevitable head-on collision with the blind rage of staff bureaucracy.
Staff bureaucracy has the face of a major from the special department, gray and haggard from chronic sleep deprivation. The deep bunker of the forward command post shudders continuously from nearby heavy artillery impacts. Dry, stinging earth showers down from the low log ceiling onto the officers' collars. The major breathes heavily and raggedly. His fists are clenched so tight, his knuckles are white. On the crudely built plank table lies a badly crumpled topographic map, worn at the folds. On it, a thick red pencil has aggressively and boldly crossed out the position that Captain Sobolev's crew just abandoned of their own accord. Unauthorized abandonment of a designated defensive line in March 1944 means only one inevitable consequence: immediate execution in front of the formation. Exposing the front in the direction of the main enemy tank wedge is equated to unconditional high treason. The air in the cramped shelter is thick and stale, saturated with the acrid smell of alkaline gun oil, sour sweat, and raw clay. "You're headed for a court-martial, Captain." The major's voice breaks into a high, raspy scream that cuts through the rumble of the distant cannonade. "You abandoned the approved directive. You've completely exposed the infantry battalion's left flank." The major slams his heavy palm onto the table. Gray dust rises slowly in the dim, pulsing light of a soot-stained kerosene lamp. The staff officer doesn't see a brilliant ice trap at all. He sees only a gross violation of combat regulations and an empty, defenseless trench in the enemy's path. Sobolev stands perfectly straight. His frozen face betrays no emotion. The crust of filthy spring mud on his sunken cheekbones dried and cracked long ago. With a slow, calculated movement, he removes his padded tank helmet, soaked in black grease and sweat. "The assigned directive is being raked by enemy fire," Sobolev says unnaturally quietly, forcing the staff officers to strain to hear. At ranges exceeding 1,200 meters, our 85mm shells cannot penetrate the sloped frontal armor of those heavy machines. That is a proven physical fact. My crew is guaranteed to burn in 3 minutes the moment visual contact is established. I will not pointlessly incinerate trained men and functional equipment for the sake of a pretty tactical mark on your paper map. That is blatant cowardice in the face of a superior enemy. The blocking detachments will cut you down with machine guns right next to your tank. Sobolev takes one sharp, heavy step forward.
Less than half a meter of stale space remains between the two heavily breathing men. The physiology of this bitter conflict is built entirely on the extreme exhaustion of the central nervous system. Captain Sobolev's eyes are the faded eyes of a man who, with his own hands worn to the bone, methodically scraped the charred remains of his comrades off scorched armor steel. In those eyes, there isn't a drop of animal fear toward a bullet from the rear or the threat of execution. In them, only a cold, predatory, calculated thirst to destroy the advancing enemy as efficiently as possible pulses monotonically. War breaks any manual, leaving the right to live only to pure pragmatism. "Come with me right now, Comrade Major," the captain hisses through tightly clamped, cracked lips. "I will give you a visual demonstration of the laws of physics. My men and the sappers breached the main dam of the old water mill. All that water went straight onto the steep paved descent to the crossing. The current frost has already hit -12. In literally 2 hours, a perfect, monolithic ice rink will form there. 45 tons of Krupp iron on smooth tracks without special grousers. The surface incline is 15 degrees. They will inevitably lose traction and break their own necks under the influence of their own colossal mass. And my gunner will methodically hammer them in their thin, vulnerable flanks from the fortified high ground." The major swallows hard, a dry lump in his parched throat. The irrefutable logic of the harsh truth from the trenches shatters the clunky framework of staff instructions. The proposed asymmetrical trap sounds like total suicidal madness to a man who thinks exclusively in standard categories of frontal strikes. But the cost of a potential mistake has become too high. At stake is the physical survival of the entire rifle corps, which would be inevitably crushed by tracks. Sobolev is wagering his own shoulder boards, his life, and the lives of his 3 subordinate tankers. He demands, harshly and without appeal, to test his unorthodox position in actual combat. This brutal clash of wills is interrupted by another shudder of the earth. Enemy long-range artillery is beginning a dense registration of the defensive sector. The time for making a strategic decision has irrevocably run out. "If your ice doesn't work as intended, Captain," the major says quietly, looking the tanker straight in the eye, "I will personally put a bullet in the back of your head. First, you'll have to punch through 32 millimeters of homogeneous turret armor," Sobolev cuts him off dryly. At the narrow entrance to the bunker, the driver and the gunner stand motionless. Their coarsened, filthy hands rest firmly on the cold, blued barrels of their submachine guns. They are ready to face the bullets of their own blocking detachments, if only to avoid burning alive in a stupid frontal attack. This isn't an army mutiny. It is the highest form of a soldier's trust in his commander, a trust forged in spilled blood, carbon monoxide ground into the lungs, and the metallic clang of heavy gun breeches. A tank is a single, inseparable living organism. If the commander has firmly decided to turn the landscape into a trap, the crew will see that task through to the end. Damp clothes soaked in icy water turn stiff in the piercing wind. But inside every man, a steady, cold flame of absolute combat concentration is burning. The decision is finally ratified by the staff's forced helplessness. Sobolev disappears quickly into the darkness of the night. Every lost minute rapidly diminishes their meager chances of survival. The crew immediately returns to their camouflaged combat vehicle. 32 tons of Soviet steel have already grown deep into the frozen ground on the prepared flanking height. The diesel engine is shut down to maintain perfect silence. The long-barreled gun is depressed and aimed exactly at the center of the ravine's narrow bottleneck. The optical sights have been carefully wiped of condensation. Heavy, armor-piercing shells are neatly distributed in the racks. The nervous anticipation becomes physically palpable, sticky, and dense.
The predatory silence presses on the eardrums far harder than the cannonade. The frozen stone bridge below is ready to receive its first heavy targets. The frozen stone bridge below is ready to receive its first heavy targets. The air above the frozen ravine begins to vibrate faintly. This vibration starts somewhere deep in the solid ground, travels through the dead, gnarled roots of trees, and manifests as a dull, aching pain in the tanker's clenched jaws. The rumble grows rapidly, heavily filling the entire surrounding space. It quickly turns into a low-frequency, rhythmic, ear-crushing roar of powerful 12-cylinder engines. A column of 30 German heavy tanks is confidently approaching the crossing. 30 massive steel boxes. Each combat vehicle weighs exactly 45 tons. They move in a tight march formation, not slowing their cruising speed in the slightest. The clatter of wide track links against the frozen, stony earth ruthlessly shakes the gray morning mist. It is an inexorable mechanical avalanche, absolutely confident in its crushing, penetrative power. Thick 80mm sloped frontal armor gives their crews a false sense of total tactical invulnerability in this narrow defile squeezed by steep heights. The long barrels of their guns look hungrily forward, ready to punch through any obstacle at ranges up to 2,000 meters. The 32-ton Soviet tank is frozen solid into the ground on the dominant flanking height. Captain Sobolev's crew has cold-bloodedly transformed their maneuverable strike machine into a stationary, lurking steel pillbox, completely merged with the lifeless landscape. The engine is shut down, not a single puff of bluish exhaust smoke. The 85mm gun looks down coldly and calculatively, aimed precisely at the geometric center of the ravine's bottleneck, locking down the field of fire. The turret is heavily draped with cut evergreen branches and generously dusted with snow mixed with clumps of filthy, frozen earth. Inside the cramped, freezing fighting compartment, there is an absolute, predatory, ringing silence. It is so dense and physically heavy that the creak of old leather straps and the raspy, ragged breathing of 4 utterly exhausted men, worn down by days of sleeplessness, are clearly audible. The temperature inside the chilled steel hull has dropped to -12 degrees. The frozen metal greedily and continuously siphons the last bits of precious warmth from the human bodies. War has absolutely no tolerance for physical or moral weakness. War is the highest form of human will concentrated in the face of imminent death. Heroism isn't a blind, bright impulse. It is the grim, masculine ability not to twitch a single muscle when cold reason screams about the mathematical impossibility of survival. The commander's fingers, encased in a filthy wool glove stiffened by machine oil and dried blood, are clamped tight on the intercom button. "They're coming!" The gunner's strained whisper sounds like a dry, lifeless rustle in the headphones. His right eye is glued to the cold rubber eyepiece of the telescopic sight. His eyelashes have long been coated in white, stinging frost from his heavy, frequent breathing. His fingers, numb and white from the cold, rest firmly on the steel handwheels of the turret traverse mechanism. "Wait," Sobolev's voice sounds perfectly level, without a single metallic or nervous note. Only dry, mechanical, merciless arithmetic calculation. "Let them pull all the way in. The lead tank must pass the mark of the old ruined mill. Nobody move." The mechanics of the impending catastrophe were dictated solely by the relentless laws of inertia and the kinetic energy of a colossal mass. The German armored vanguard, maintaining high RPMs as their engines roared without slowing, slammed full tilt into the narrow throat of a steep, stone-paved descent. The enemy drivers, peering through the narrow slits of thick armored vision blocks, saw nothing but an ordinary cobblestone road lightly dusted with morning frost. They were physically unable to see through their periscopes the thin, perfectly smooth mirror of ice carefully hidden in the deep, impenetrable shadow of the right-hand embankment.
The distance between the multi-ton machines and the tight march column was no more than 15 meters. The heavy, angular behemoths hurtled downward, propelled by their own massive, destructive weight. 45 tons of high-quality Krupp steel had been accelerated to 20 kilometers per hour. The center of gravity of each individual machine was critically shifted forward due to the massive armored turret and the long, heavy main gun. The entire architecture of the German tank attack was rigidly calculated for maximum fire density and continuous forward momentum. Stopping in such complex, rugged terrain was a swift death sentence for the entire battalion.
30 heavy tank guns were now absolutely useless, their sectors of fire completely blocked by the friendly vehicles ahead and the steep slopes of the deep ravine. The enemy turret gunners stared intensely into the gray shroud of the morning fog, expecting at any second to encounter Soviet anti-tank batteries at point-blank range. None of them were looking down beneath their own wide steel tracks. The Soviet tankers knew this critical blind spot intimately. Knowledge of the enemy's technical anatomy provided the one tiny advantage capable of compensating for a catastrophic lack of direct armor penetration. A blunt-nosed 85mm shell would never punch through a thick, sloped frontal plate, but it was guaranteed to crunch through a thin, vertical side hull if the heavy enemy machine could be forced to turn broadside. The primal fear inside the Soviet tank was now completely paralyzed by an extreme, toxic surge of adrenaline. The loader's heart beat heavily and rhythmically, like a cast-iron hammer striking a steel anvil. In his hands, bloody, raw, and caked in ingrained gunpowder soot, he gripped the first heavy armor-piercing shell, weighing 9.2 kilograms, with white-knuckled intensity. The sharp, invasive chemical smell of thick gun grease and spent diesel mixed with the sour, acrid stench of sweat. The men had finally transformed into auxiliary mechanisms of the cannon. The commander's gaze, fixed through the coated optics of the panoramic sight, tracked every microscopic movement of the enemy armored wedge. The lead tank rapidly passed the ruins of a wooden dam. Its wide steel tracks, designed by engineers solely to distribute pressure on soft ground, bore down heavily on the slippery, artificially created shell of ice. The tension inside the frozen turret of the Soviet vehicle reached a critical breaking point. This was a fraction of a second of absolute, ringing balance between continued life and an instantaneous, filthy death in burning diesel. This single second would decide the outcome of a multi-day defensive operation. The crew had finally merged as one with the cold, blued metal of the massive breach, the fragile glass optics of the precision sights, and the stiff, cast-iron control pedals. They were no longer living people of weak flesh and blood. They were the cocked firing mechanism of a precision surgical instrument, ready to methodically cut through thick, stubborn enemy armor. The enemy, driven by their own massive, lumbering weight and blind tactical overconfidence, was driving themselves into a lethal trap. The moment of truth arrived the instant the first heavy machine lost traction. The first heavy machine irreversibly lost its grip on the steep, ice-slicked slope. 45 tons of high-quality German armor suddenly stopped obeying the stiff control levers. The wide track links, meticulously designed to traverse soft European soil, slid helplessly across the mirror-smooth ice. The coefficient of friction plummeted toward zero. The driver of the lead tank instinctively made a fatal mistake. Yielding to panic, he slammed his heavy, hobnailed boot onto the brake pedals, locking both tracks dead. The laws of relentless mass immediately punished this second of fear. The massive kinetic inertia of the multi-ton steel hull, multiplied by a speed of 20 kilometers per hour and a 15-degree descent, ruthlessly threw the vehicle into an uncontrollable lateral skid. The heavy tank swung broadside across the narrow stone road. With a deafening, sickening screech of crushing metal, the long barrel of the 70mm gun slammed with enormous force into the rocky slope of the ravine. From the monstrous kinetic impact, the barrel bent unnaturally, jamming the massive turret hard into the geared turret ring.
War is not a triumph of the human spirit. It is the absolute dictatorship of merciless physics. The second armored vehicle following behind lacked the time to drop the high marching RPMs of its powerful engine. The short interval of only 15 meters left the driver no chance for a life-saving maneuver. The second steel monster, with a strained roar, hit the slippery ice and, at full speed, crunched into the immobilized leader, ramming it directly in the thin side armor. The powerful shockwave instantly shattered the internal bulkheads of the fighting compartment. Thick steel mounting bolts snapped with a dry crack. The heavy road wheels of the suspension flew out of their sockets with a loud, clanging ring. The track chains snapped with the piercing crack of a cannon shot, coiling into a useless, mangled metal heap. The chaos escalated through a rapid chain reaction. The third, fourth, and fifth machines slid relentlessly into the steel meat grinder forming below. They slammed into one another with dull thuds, ruthlessly crushing track fenders and shearing off toothed drive sprockets. The deafening screech of tearing, case-hardened Krupp steel completely drowned out the roar of dozens of engines. This wasn't just the sound of a vehicle accident. This was the terrifying sound of the enemy offensive's spine snapping in half. The pride of German technical thought turned into a helpless, pulsating pile of mangled metal in a matter of seconds. This smoking plug sealed the narrow neck of the icy ravine tight. The remaining 25 combat vehicles of the column were forced to slam on their brakes on the iced-over stones. They found themselves pinned between sheer earthen slopes and their own destroyed vanguard. The engineering trap had snapped shut with mathematical precision. The fearsome, invincible war machines had turned into static, helplessly spinning targets. The triumph of precise local topographical knowledge over frontal armor thickness was now undeniable. In the intercepted enemy radio traffic, through the thick, continuous crackle of static, genuine animal hysteria broke through. "We're blocked! The tracks won't hold! We're sliding down!" The German company commander's voice cracked into a panicked falsetto. "Everyone back! Reverse immediately!" the radio speaker screamed. But the way back was closed by a solid wall of heavy machines, blindly pushing from the rear. Retreat became a physical impossibility. A clearly organized military march had rapidly degenerated into a lethal crush. The psychological terror of the crews, locked inside sliding multi-ton coffins, became a tangible factor of the battle. They realized their absolute vulnerability. The thick 80mm frontal protection no longer had any tactical significance. The massive machines were chaotically turned toward the Soviet ambush with their most vulnerable sides, only 40mm thick. Inside the motionless Soviet tank on the camouflaged flanking height, there was absolute, tomb-like silence. The men had practically stopped breathing, conserving their meager oxygen. They watched this horrific man-made catastrophe through the narrow, dusty slits of the vision blocks. The sharp contrast between the deafening metallic screech of the dying armored column below and the total silence inside the cramped ambush weighed heavily on their exhausted psyches. A cold engineering mind had dispassionately, ruthlessly trampled brute mechanical force. Captain Sobolev clenched his jaw until it cracked. His gaunt face looked as if it were carved from grey stone, coated in a layer of old gunpowder soot. The calloused fingers of his right hand settled firmly onto the black PTT switch. "Sides are wide open," the commander stated dryly, without a shadow of joy, staring into the crosshairs of the panoramic sight. "Range exactly 400 meters.
Load armor-piercing. Aim for the turret ring. Fire! The short, clipped order instantly triggered a well-oiled conveyor of death. With a fierce, raspy exhale, the loader rammed the heavy 9-kilogram round into the open breech. The steel sliding block breech closed with a loud, metallic thud. The gunner, smoothly and without a tremor in his hands, aligned the chevron of the optical sight with the black cross on the grey side of a stuck enemy machine. Man and machine finally merged into a single, flawless algorithm of destruction. In this brief moment, there was no room for blind hatred or pity. There was only the rigid, ballistic calculation of a piece of white-hot steel intended to punch through armor, spray a stream of lethal fragments inside the fighting compartment, and ignite gasoline vapors. The long barrel of the 85mm gun recoiled sharply, beginning the methodical execution of the trapped targets. The first shot ripped through the silence of the ravine with a deafening, whip-like crack. The massive steel breech recoiled backward with furious speed, nearly crushing the gunner's shoulder. The hot, soot-covered brass casing ejected with a piercing ring onto the metal floor, belching a thick, suffocating cloud of acrid blue-grey powder gas. The heavy, armor-piercing shell covered the 400-meter distance in a fraction of a second. It slammed exactly into the center of the thin 40mm side armor of the trapped vehicle. The enormous kinetic energy of the steel slug smashed through the brittle Krupp steel with the dry, disgusting crunch of a snapping spine. Inside the enemy fighting compartment, the ammunition load detonated instantly. The heavy turret was slowly, unnaturally torn from the ruptured turret ring and collapsed with a roar onto the neighboring machine, flattening its engine compartment like a pancake. War is no place for ceremonial marches. It is the ruthless, methodical disposal of human flesh and expensive iron. Inside the frozen Soviet tank, there was no room for triumph. Here, a blind, monotonous factory conveyor of death worked without pause. The men had lost their individual human traits, turning into filthy, soot-covered pistons of this lethal mechanism. "Armor-piercing," Captain Sobolev rasped hoarsely, swallowing the suffocating smoke that burned his throat. "Ready!" The heavy breech clanged under the loader's bloody, blistered hands. "On the way," the gunner responded shortly, lifelessly, stomping the foot-firing pedal. The rapidly vanishing seconds compressed into a single, pulsating cycle. The violent extraction of the casing, rapid loading, precise aiming, the whip-crack shot. And again, the deafening ring of falling brass. The electric vent on the ceiling wailed at maximum RPMs, but failed to clear the thick, toxic shroud of carbon monoxide. The tanker's inflamed eyes watered from the sting. Dark blood flowed in thin trickles from their noses and ears due to the constant, destructive pressure shifts inside the iron box. Their breath caught in harsh spasms, but their hardened hands continued to rhythmically ram the heavy rounds into the red-hot breech. This was the limit of human physiology, driven by the primal instinct for survival. The trapped German heavy machines, jammed together in a disorganized heap, exposed their most vulnerable sides to the continuous, sniper-accurate fire. The multi-ton steel monsters roared desperately, their wide tracks spinning helplessly on the impenetrable mirror of ice. They frantically tried to turn their thick frontal armor toward the invisible threat, but only bit harder into each other on the narrow descent. The perfectly calculated, merciless geometry of the engineering trap robbed them of any chance for a maneuver. The deep ravine rapidly transformed into a churning cauldron of fire. The blue-grey diesel exhaust mixed with the thick, greasy black smoke of burning synthetic gasoline. Armor plates cracked from within from the constant secondary detonations of ammo racks. High tongues of flame greedily licked the remnants of gray winter camo paint off the glowing metal.
Heavy corps artillery rapidly joined the execution. Precise coordinates transmitted by Captain Sobolev's radio operator directed a lethal steel storm straight into the center of the blocked defile. A blood-curdling howl descended from the low gray sky. Soviet 152mm howitzers began to methodically plow the floor of the icy ravine, square by square, with heavy, high-explosive shells. The frozen earth shudders from the monstrous explosions, throwing thousands of tons of mud, pieces of torn tracks, and mangled suspension elements into the air. The physics of total destruction reached its absolute peak. Through the thick, low cloud cover, Soviet ground attack planes dropped out with the characteristic heavy drone of powerful engines. The predatory machines entered a steep dive directly over the burning gorge. Their 23mm automatic cannons stitched through the thin top armor of the enemy engine compartments with long, merciless bursts of tracer fire. Each passing plane dropped its lethal payload, adding new clusters of fire to this terrifying man-made hell. The raid lasted only a few minutes, but left behind nothing but a scorched, smoking wasteland of twisted iron. The turning point of the battle was achieved not by a sacrificial bayonet charge, but by cynical, cold engineering calculation and precision fire. The massive breakthrough of the enemy tank wedge had forever choked in roaring fire and its own enormous helplessness. The dry, uncompromising statistics of this heavy March morning recorded the total destruction of 17 enemy heavy tanks. 17 smoking hulks remained forever on the ice-covered slope near the old ruined mill. The true horror of this situation for the enemy lay not in the superiority of the Soviet gun caliber, but in the absolute, paralyzing futility of a position where ultra-powerful technology became merely a common mass grave for its own crews. No tears, only the dry mathematics of total annihilation. Inside the scorching turret of the Soviet tank, a heavy, ringing silence slowly descended. It was broken only by the quiet, ominous hissing of the cooling gun and the heavy, wet coughing of the loader. The shell basket was filled to the brim with spent hot brass. The main load of armor-piercing shells was almost entirely exhausted. The depleted men sat in total darkness, their inflamed eyes shut tight, trying simply to take one steady breath without the acrid taint of burnt powder. They had performed their filthiest work with cold precision, but the echo of this incredible battle was already flying along field telephone wires to the rear. The exhausted front command, which only an hour ago was preparing for a catastrophic breakthrough, received the first dry, clipped radiograms. The stunned staff generals were only beginning to realize the true scale and brilliance of the tanker's unconventional maneuver. The sight of the burning steel graveyard would forever change the course of the entire offensive operation. The burning steel graveyard at the bottom of the ravine radiated a heavy, suffocating heat. The smell of molten aluminum, burnt diesel, and charred human flesh hung in a thick layer in the freezing air. The mangled hulks of 17 45-ton machines slowly cooled under the gray, indifferent spring sky. The thick Krupp steel emitted a long, eerie crunch as the metal snapped along factory welds due to the sharp temperature drop. The artificial ice under the shattered tracks had long since boiled away. In its place remained only scorched, stony earth, soaked in motor oil and blood. This apocalyptic landscape of total technical destruction was silently studied by the high command arriving at the front. A mud-splattered commander's vehicle braked sharply at the edge of the cliff. The general climbed heavily out of the cabin, his polished boots sinking into the cold March mud. He stared down into the smoking abyss for a long time without blinking. The scale of the rout shattered all familiar staff templates. The powerful frontal strike of an entire enemy armored battalion had been stopped not by a bloody head-on battle of attrition, but by a single, absolutely cold,
merciless topographical calculation. The debriefing took place directly on the sooty, rough armor of the still-hot Soviet tank. 32 tons of cast Soviet steel stood motionless on the height. The long barrel of the 85mm gun, covered in thick gray soot, was lowered heavily. The massive breach inside the turret still burned the tired hands of the loader. The cooling diesel engine clicked quietly, releasing its heat to the piercing wind. Captain Sobolev's crew was lined up in a straight rank near the track, which was splattered with bloody mud. The faces of the 4 tankers were completely covered in a thick crust of black powder soot mixed with dried sweat. The men's eyes were red and inflamed from the acrid carbon monoxide. Their hands trembled uncontrollably from the extreme nervous tension and total muscular exhaustion. The general walked right up to the formation. In his hard gaze, there wasn't a drop of empty excitement, only a dry, professional assessment of surgically precise and brutal work. "Report, Captain." The general's voice sounded muffled, barely overcoming the distant, monotonous rumble of the fading artillery to the east. 17 enemy heavy machines destroyed, Sobolev barked dryly, his face remaining stone-like. A directed nighttime water discharge was used on the paved descent at a strict 15-degree angle. The formation of a monolithic ice coating led to a total loss of the friction coefficient for the smooth tracks. The enemy completely lost control of their mass. The firing range for armor-piercing shells against the exposed side plates was exactly 400 meters. Total ammunition expenditure, 32 fixed rounds. No casualties among the vehicle's personnel. Equipment is fully operational. "Physics worked better than a steel forehead," the general said slowly. He shifted his heavy gaze from the exhausted captain to the smoking valley of death below. 80 millimeters of their vaunted frontal armor mean absolutely nothing if a 45-ton machine is physically unable to stand on its own tracks. With a sharp, practiced movement, the general unfastened his leather field map case. He pulled out 4 orders of the red banner, their enamel gleaming dully. There was no place here for solemn speeches or brass bands. He simply, silently, and forcefully drove the thick, sharp screws of the awards directly into the filthy, grease-soaked padded jackets of the tankers. For the flawless execution of the assigned combat mission, the commander dropped the words curtly. The heroism of a single crew is merely a local tactical success. The systemic, scaled replication of this cold calculation is a weapon of total destruction. War forgives a soldier for the weakness of the flesh, but it punishes the poverty of the engineering mind cruelly and immediately. The command instantly realized the breakthrough potential of this unconventional maneuver. The trap at the ruined mill forever ceased to be a single episode of desperate improvisation. It instantly became the foundation of a new tactical doctrine for the entire advancing tank corps. Right here, on the frozen armor of the cooling tank that smelled of burnt metal, a final, rigid decision was made. A decision for a radical, immediate change in the methods of conducting tank warfare in the harsh conditions of the spring thaw. The general snaps a wide operations map, cluttered with markings, across the ribbed engine deck of the Soviet tank. "From this second, Sobolev, your crew is officially detached from the battalion's line units," the general barks, stabbing a gnarled, grime-caked finger at the winding blue veins of the rivers. "You're becoming the tactical nerve center for our corps' special strike group. The objective is dead simple. Deep topographical analysis, pinpointing critical vulnerabilities in enemy logistics, laying a non-stop series of dynamic, lethal engineering traps across the entire breadth of our offensive. We aren't hitting them head-on anymore. We're going to systematically break their legs." The veterans, ignoring bone-deep exhaustion, dive into the meticulous study of blue and brown contour lines. Only dry, clipped reports and short professional remarks are heard. There is an instantaneous mathematical assessment of slope gradients and the load-bearing capacity of the frozen ground. The human brain continues to function with surgical precision, like a reliable, blood-slicked clockwork mechanism. A meticulous analysis of the operational situation reveals new, even more terrifying large-scale opportunities for the enemy. The paper map is thick with dozens of natural water obstacles, small, nameless tributaries, and deep, impassable ravines. The successful experience of cold-bloodedly gunning down a bogged-down heavy column demands immediate, widespread scaling. Every hollow, every creek locked in thick March ice is now viewed exclusively as a potential guaranteed kill zone for German armor. Sobolev's crew, having not yet washed the embedded cordite soot from their inflamed faces, begins to methodically draft entirely new schemes for utilizing the terrain. They cold-bloodedly calculate flank attack vectors, maximum gun elevation angles, and the exact freezing time of areas flooded with icy water. A rigorous engineering approach to war has finally and irrevocably displaced blind soldierly rage. Precise ballistic and physical calculation becomes the only religion for the battalion's survival. Preparation for a new, deadly thrust begins immediately. Line tank battalions receive strict, non-negotiable orders. Completely cease senseless frontal assaults on fortified steel strongpoints. Use attached sapper units exclusively for the surgical, calculated alteration of the surrounding landscape. Ahead, beyond the horizon, lies a powerful, deep-echeloned German defense along a wide water barrier. The enemy generals are absolutely certain their positions are securely shielded by an insurmountable natural obstacle. But the Soviet tankers already know exactly how to turn the arrogant enemy's main tactical advantage into his own massive, icy mass grave. The ringing, cold logic of professionals prepares to deliver a new, crushing blow exactly where classical tactical laws deem it absolutely impossible. The looming deathmatch demands extreme audacity in maneuver and surgical precision from the drivers on the frozen rivers. The wide water barrier to the west has been turned by the German command into an impregnable steel-fortified zone. Concrete bunkers bristled with the long barrels of 88mm anti-aircraft guns. The mathematics of a meeting engagement on the open ice of the main river is ruthless. A German armor-piercing shell weighing 9.2 kilograms punches through the frontal armor of a Soviet tank at a distance of 2,000 meters. 45 millimeters of sloped plate cannot stop a kinetic impact of such monstrous destructive power. A frontal assault across the smooth, open expanse of the main water artery means guaranteed death. The tank core would simply bleed out, turning into a burning conveyor belt of twisted metal in minutes. War is not a chessboard. It is a slaughterhouse, where only those who know how to strike outside the established rules survive. The battalion command prepares the men for a hopeless, suicidal charge. But Captain Sobolev has a different calculation. Topographical analysis shows a narrow, winding tributary hidden by steep, wooded banks. It leads directly into the flank of the German artillery group. The riverbed is locked in March ice. The ice is exactly 60 centimeters thick. 32 tons of cast Soviet steel create critical ground pressure on the frozen surface. A driver's error of a single degree in turn angle, or a sudden drop in diesel engine RPM, means an instant plunge through the ice. The crew and the machine would hit the dark, silty bottom in 10 seconds. Water would flood the fighting compartment, leaving zero chance to open the heavy turret hatches. But this is the only chance to break the back of the enemy defense. Sobolev proposes delivering a crushing blow where it is physically unexpected. To send the heavy machines into a controlled slide
right down the bed of the frozen river. Preparation requires surgical precision and the harshest discipline. The tankers work in absolute silence. Massive steel hulls are thickly coated in layers of white lime. The machines blend into the dead winter landscape. The load of armor-piercing and high-explosive shells is cut to the minimum to reduce overall weight. Extra tens of kilograms now means certain death in the icy water. The briefing for the drivers takes place in a cramped, freezing dugout. Sobolev speaks in clipped tones, looking into the bloodshot, inflamed eyes of his subordinates. "We go at max RPM." The commander's voice clanks like a gun breech. "Interval is exactly 50 meters. No gear shifting. Don't touch the steering clutches. Straight run only. One machine stopping means death for everyone." "The ice won't hold, Comrade Captain," a gray-haired driver from a neighboring crew mutters hollowly. He wipes grease-stained hands on a dirty tunic. "The ice will hold the speed. Keep those 500 horses pinned. The mass won't have time to crush the crust if we clear this stretch in 3 minutes. Execute." No discussion. The order converts into immediate, sharp action. The crews take their places in the freezing fighting compartments. A sudden start. Dozens of 12-cylinder engines roar simultaneously, tearing through the ringing silence of the frosty morning. Exhaust pipes spit thick blue-gray smoke. The machines lunge from camouflaged positions. A tank is maneuverable fury. The machines hit the icy surface of the narrow tributary at full throttle. Speed instantly hits 40 kilometers per hour. Wide tracks hammer the smooth surface, finding almost no traction. Surgical driving on the edge of human reflexes becomes the only guarantee of survival. The drivers grip the stiff levers with white-knuckled fingers, feeling every microscopic vibration of the multi-ton machines. The ice beneath the dozens of tons roars and groans deeply. A dull, menacing crack spreads in all directions from the hurtling hulls. The German anti-tank gun crews are paralyzed by primal shock. Their Zeiss optical sights are locked onto the wide bend of the main river. The appearance of Soviet armored vehicles from a narrow forest trap at extreme speed completely shatters the established defensive fire system. The enemy gunners frantically, in primitive panic, try to traverse their heavy guns, breaking the stiff horizontal aiming mechanisms. 32 tons of Soviet metal streak past them far faster than the trained German crews can ram heavy fixed rounds into the breaches. The risk of instantly sinking to the bottom of the dark, icy tributary pays off with absolute, paralyzing surprise. The loaders in the turrets don't even touch the shell racks. The 85mm guns are absolutely useless right now. The main crushing weapon is the colossal kinetic energy of the flying armored steel itself. The daring maneuver forever nullifies the thickness of Krupp protection and the ballistics of the flak guns. Sobolev's tank leads. The violent vibration of the steel hull rattles the soul. The view through the narrow vision slit is just a blurred, continuous white streak and ice chips hammering the glass. Acrid sweat pours into the driver's eyes, ruthlessly stinging inflamed red eyelids. The tachometer needle is frozen in the red zone. The powerful diesel engine howls strainingly at the limit of its technical resource, ready at any second to choke on its own boiling oil. The enemy's fortified positions approach rapidly, inevitably. Ahead lies a low, sloping bank, thick with deep trenches and concrete machine gun nests. The machine is ready at any moment to make the decisive, deadly leap onto solid ground. But the ruthless nature of war never tolerates perfectly laid plans. The exhausted ice refuses to hold the monstrous, concentrated stress. Directly behind the lead command tank, an ear-splitting crack rings out. The laws of physics again remind him of their uncompromising, dictatorial power, turning the solid surface into a death trap as one of the following machines slides into a fatal skid. The fatal skid on the ruptured ice lasts no more than 3 long, agonizing seconds. 32 tons of cast Soviet steel, out of control at 40 kilometers per hour, spin with a deafening screech around their vertical axis. Wide tracks frantically mill the brittle, frozen surface. The overstressed winter monolith cannot withstand the monstrous concentrated pressure. The 60-centimeter thick ice crust snaps with the terrifying dry bang of a heavy artillery shot. Black, bone-chilling water, with a primal roar, instantly swallows the heavy war machine, along with the 4 men trapped inside. A massive geyser of ice chips and filthy bottom sludge soars into the gray March sky. None of the following crews drop their engine RPMs. No one tries to swerve. War does not mourn the fallen. It only scrupulously tallies the tactical advantages won by their deaths. Braking on this broken, groaning route means guaranteed death at the bottom of the river for the entire strike group. The remaining steel pack tears forward relentlessly with a deafening roar of engines, leaping over the spreading black cracks at maximum speed. 5 went under, the radio operator rasps into the throat mics, frantically swallowing a hard lump in his parched throat. Shoreline dead ahead, Captain Sobolev's voice sounds absolutely lifeless, like the metallic clank of a gun breech. Prepare for a hard impact. Pin the throttle. The lead tank slams into the icy, steep embankment with monstrous force. For a brief moment, the multi-ton machine hangs heavily in the air, its front road wheels lifting off solid support. The laws of gravity violently hurl the massive steel hull onto the frozen ground. The impact is of such destructive force that the tanker's teeth clatter loudly, biting through lips until they bleed. The suspension groans under the extreme overload. Powerful steel springs inside the hull compress to their limit, threatening to rip the road wheel arms out by the roots. But the metal holds. Without losing any of its colossal kinetic energy, the tank bursts directly into the deep enemy rear. The German defense, built on rigid, perfect classical templates of shoreline protection, is completely paralyzed. The enemy artillerymen are physically unable to grasp the fact of a heavy armor breakthrough from a direction that staff maps considered an absolutely impassable natural barrier. The famous German 88mm anti-aircraft gun is a flawless, mathematically precise instrument for destroying any armor in open spaces. Its heavy armor-piercing shell has a muzzle velocity of over 800 meters per second and can penetrate the frontal protection of a Soviet machine at a range of over 2,000 meters. But the massive cruciform carriage, weighing over 7 tons, makes a rapid horizontal traverse of the long barrel a physically impossible task. The German crews, in primitive panic, try to swing the heavy guns toward the rear, straining their backs and breaking the stiff aiming mechanisms. The Soviet crews don't give them a single second for this saving maneuver. The 85mm guns are silent now. The main, crushing caliber is the 32-ton mass of the tank itself, hurtling at 35 kilometers per hour. Wide steel tracks, with a sickening crunch, grind the thin outriggers of the German guns, wooden crates of fragmentation shells, and the crew members who didn't jump aside in time into the frozen earth. Inside the cramped fighting compartment of the Soviet machine, there is an unbearable, suffocating stench of burnt diesel, sour sweat, and ground metal. The driver works the stiff steering clutch levers in a state of absolute, deafening trance. His palms, rubbed into raw meat, no longer feel the sharp pain. They have merged with the steel. The tank spins frantically on the spot, crushing mortar nests with its heavy tracks, flattening light staff communication cars into pancakes, and collapsing the log ceilings of deep bunkers. This is the pure triumph of Soviet maneuver warfare in its most brutal, absolute dynamics. Total dominance of a flexible, non-standard tactical mind
over a rigid, sluggish enemy defense.
The surviving machines sow blind animal panic in the enemy ranks. The enemy front, stripped of its heavy artillery shield and command coordination, begins to rapidly crumble like overfired slag. The strike to the unprotected back completely paralyzes entire infantry regiments. Behind the breakthrough tankers, assault battalions of the Rifle Corps are already landing on the captured shore in a continuous stream. The bloody line of contact has been irrevocably breached. Cold calculation and the animal audacity of the maneuver saved tens of thousands of lives of ordinary infantrymen who would have senselessly burned in a frontal assault on the mined ice of the wide river. The price of this incredible breakthrough is measured not in beautiful words of gratitude, but in mangled machines, scorched nerves, and comrades left forever in the dark water. 2 days after the total collapse of the enemy front, in a frozen field headquarters thick with the smell of medicine and coarse tobacco, the army commander dryly reads out a short order. Captain Sobolev, whose haggard face has turned into a motionless gray mask from chronic sleep deprivation and embedded soot, receives the highest state award. No ceremonial brass bands or loud patriotic speeches, only a heavy piece of platinum and gold, the Order of Lenin, settles into the commander's dirty, oil-soaked palm. This is the dry payment for a radical change in the tactics of entire army formations. For the fact that the harsh mathematics of survival proved significantly stronger than Krupp armor. The global strategic task is complete. The impregnable water barrier is finally broken, and the heavy armada of Soviet forces begins its relentless, thundering movement to the west. The tactical maneuver scheme, born in icy mud and paid for with the limit of human physical capabilities, becomes a death sentence for the enemy defense throughout the rest of the offensive. The metal tracks of the heavy machines continue to methodically grind foreign soil, bringing the end of this dirty, grueling work closer, meter by meter. Ahead lie new, deep rivers, new concrete-poured bunkers, and ruined European cities. The path of the surviving crew inevitably leads through thousands of kilometers of scorched territory, where the finale of this bloody confrontation must forever settle on the armor, like the gray ash of the destroyed capital of the Reich. The gray ash of the destroyed capital of the Reich swirls endlessly in the still, dead air. May 1945. This heavy, sticky ash settles in a thick layer on the cooling armor of the 32-ton Soviet war machines. The air in the very center of ruined Berlin is saturated through and through with the acrid, sour smell of burnt red brick, TNT fumes, and stagnant water from ruptured underground utilities. War is not a ceremonial march with unfurled banners to the sound of brass bands. War is the methodical wear and tear of gun barrels and the human psyche to the state of brittle glass, ready to shatter into dust at any second. Captain Sobolev's war machine is frozen at a wide intersection, heavily littered with broken stone and the mangled wreckage of German 88mm anti-aircraft guns. The powerful 12-cylinder diesel engine is silenced forever. The long 85mm gun is lowered heavily and helplessly. The thick, homogeneous armor of the turret is deeply scarred with jagged furrows from enemy armor-piercing rounds that scored the tough steel but did not penetrate. Of the crew that took that first impossible March fight by the ice-covered old mill in 1944, only 2 stand on this square, the commander and the gunner. The others remained forever on the long, bloody path, burned in icy crossings, viscous peat bogs, and cramped, barricaded stone European streets. A ringing, dense, cotton-like silence suddenly falls upon the men's concussed eardrums. It cuts the hearing far more painfully and sharply than the continuous, blood-chilling howl of falling, heavy, high-explosive bombs. The complex mechanics of human perception, for years tuned strictly to recognize the whistle of a flying fragment and the screech of tearing metal, suffers a major glitch. Men accustomed to breathing only thick carbon monoxide from the breech and boiling diesel fumes physically choke on this sudden, calm spring oxygen. Sobolev slowly runs his roughened hand, covered in embedded black machine oil, along the cooling barrel of the gun. "The gun is completely cold," the gunner says hollowly, his voice cracked. He mechanically, out of muscle habit developed to the point of automation, wipes the gray concrete dust from the massive steel wedge breech with a piece of dirty rag. "There are no more shells in the racks. They all went into the Reichstag. The floor is empty. Drain the remaining water from the radiators." Sobolev's voice sounds absolutely dry, steady, without the slightest hint of ceremony or pathos. The phrases are clipped, as short as possible. "Remove the machine guns. Take the optics. This machine won't fire at anyone ever again. We have completed the assigned task." Their documented combat breakthroughs are already neatly filed in thick cardboard folders in the General Staff safes. Hundreds of pages of typewritten text with precise topographical calculations, schemes of directed nocturnal water releases, and tables of traction coefficients for smooth tracks on frozen ground. These dry, emotionless analytical reports forever become the highest standard of the victory of a living, cold, and flexible engineering mind over the brute, sluggish, straightforward thickness of metal. 80 millimeters of frontal Krupp protection proved absolutely powerless against the ruthless laws of gravity and kinetics, directed by the precise hand of Soviet tankers. The enemy's massive 45-ton machines were methodically turned into burning steel mass graves only because their blind, arrogant strength collided with a mathematically precise calculation of vulnerability. The horror of the crew's total loneliness in the face of a colossal advancing armada was replaced by methodical, monotonous factory work in the disposal of enemy equipment. On the shattered cobblestones of the Berlin Square lie tens of thousands of tons of twisted iron, mangled by fire. But inside the survivors, there is no more blind rage. Only a ringing, physically palpable emptiness remains, until the very end of the heavy duty performed. They look at the defeated city with absolutely no gloating. The veteran's hard gaze is now the gaze of a cold-blooded builder, dryly assessing the colossal volume of upcoming earthworks to clear the rubble. They make a firm, harsh, masculine decision to leave this monstrous slaughter behind forever, in closed archives. Their hands, rubbed into bloody calluses, once used to ramming heavy 9-kilogram fixed rounds into the glowing breech of the gun, must now take up heavy blacksmith hammers, carpenter axes, and tractor levers in their calloused palms. Sobolev sits heavily on the ribbed fender of his halted war machine. With a slow movement, he unbuttons the collar of his cotton tunic, soaked through with sweat, gray dust, and others' blood. On his sunken chest, the enamel of the Orders of the Red Banner and the highest state award, the Order of Lenin, glints dully. But these pieces of precious metal have absolutely no weight compared to the monstrous burden of the experience lived through. Creative, peaceful, monotonous labor must finally and irrevocably displace the reflexes of instant killing absorbed by the spinal cord. This is the only possible physiological way to preserve the meager remains of a mangled human psyche. The war ended with the dry statement of the fact of signing the documents of unconditional surrender. And right ahead lies a colossal, unthinkable work in its scale. Restoring blown-up railway bridges, demining fields, and rebuilding factory shops wiped off the face of the earth. In this calm, silent, and courageous dignity lies the true finale. The professionals who went through the terrible meat grinder of frontal collisions and icy marches survived not thanks to blind luck or a chance coincidence of circumstances. They survived in spite of the inexorable laws of ballistics, relying exclusively on their hard mathematical calculation, flawless knowledge of mechanisms, and a phenomenal ability to maintain icy calm in the very epicenter of a raging firestorm. The steel storm has finally subsided, dissolving into the spring sky. The surviving crew casts a final, heavy look at the long barrel of their gun, riddled with deep scars from fragments. They silently turn their backs on the metal, and, stepping slowly and heavily in their worn-out leather boots across the gray Berlin ash, they walk away. They walk into the deafening silence to begin the hardest work of all, the work of returning to life.